Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to another video on the channel, and today I'm going to be discussing Ignatius of Antioch and his actual beliefs on the Eucharist. Now, if you're familiar with a lot of Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodoxy arguments regarding the Eucharist, you most likely know that they commonly appeal to Ignatius in order to prove their specific view of the Eucharist. And in this video, I'm going to explain how Ignatius didn't actually have Rome's particular doctrine in mind when discussing the Eucharist, as they like to say. Not even close. And so, let's start off with this. First and foremost, what do they actually appeal to when discussing Ignatius? Well, in his letters to the Cimmerians, and people pronounce it differently, that's how I pronounce it, he has a letter written to Christians specifically warning about the Docetists. And if you don't know who the Docetists are, the Docetists was an early church heresy, a group of people who actually proclaimed that Christ, if he truly was God, he could not die on the cross because a divine being wouldn't be able to die in a human body or have a human nature. So what they like to say is that Christ invisibly died on the cross. He didn't actually die. And so this is who Ignatius is dealing with when writing these letters. And he has a lot of chapters regarding them, and he's writing to his people warning against this specific heresy so they don't fall into error as well. When we get to chapters 6 through 7, he's discussing what these specific people abstain for, or what they don't partake in. And let me read you the exact quote. "Let no man deceive himself. Both the things which are in heaven and the glorious angels and rulers, both visible and invisible, if they believe not in the blood of Christ, shall in consequence incur condemnation. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." Matthew 19:12. "Let not high place puff anyone up, for that which is worth all is faith and love, to which nothing is to be preferred. But consider those who are of a different opinion with respect to the grace of Christ which has come unto us. They abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer, because they confess not the Eucharist to be the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ, which suffered for our sins, and which the Father of his goodness raised up again." And this is the epistles to the Cimmerians, chapters 6 through 7. This is the usual, and I would say 80% of arguments which they use from Ignatius, or when they appeal to him, come from this specific passage. And there's some things to keep in mind when regarding the church fathers, such as Ignatius himself. The first point, Ignatius was not an inspired author. His words are not God-breathed. He is fallible and perfectly capable of error. If Ignatius was taught transubstantiation, how does that have any contingency on our beliefs? That just means he must be wrong. And you might point out, if you're a Roman Catholic watching this, is that Ignatius, living so close to the time of Christ and having ancient Greek as his own native language, he's much more likely to have understood the Eucharist compared to us. And if you ever discuss with anyone using Ignatius, they will surely bring this point up. But this carries multiple problems along with it. One, it's an appeal to tradition fallacy, which is fallacious because it involves proposing an assumption of superiority just because it's older and has withstood the test of time. And the reason this is fallacious and how this is even relevant to Ignatius in the first place is because they say, well, our church has been appealing to Ignatius for thousands of years. And so because we've held on to this tradition or interpretation of Ignatius, it must be true. But that is fallacious. The other point I'd like to make is that it is an argument from proximity, which is also fallacious, because it suggests that just because something is more immediate or closer to a time or an event or understanding, it must be more accurate or true. And the fallacy assumes that temporal closeness guarantees a better understanding or more reliable information. And so yes, Ignatius living close to the apostles themselves can provide valuable content. It doesn't automatically validate its truthfulness. And so, as we all know, early propositions, early letters, early writings don't automatically make one more likely to be right. Many of the letters in the New Testament, the epistles, were written as refutations of false doctrines that have already sprung up within the first decades of the church while the apostles were still active in teaching. For example, Acts 20:30 through 31 and 2 Peter 2:1 through 3 are warnings to churches who were involved in heresy. And this was involved in the same exact time as the apostles. So here's my point. If someone could be wrong on such seemingly obvious things, for example, the Judaizers in Galatians regarding how one must be saved, if someone could be so wrong on such seemingly obvious topics within 20 years of Christ's death, 50 years, how much more likely for someone to get something wrong within 70 years after Christ, such as Ignatius? And so there's my first point. The point is that even if Ignatius did believe in this, we could still disregard it. But I have a second point. There's not enough substantiation to even prove he believed in transubstantiation. If you were getting your entire argument that Ignatius believed in a literal Eucharist from these two chapters, it's not nearly enough in order to prove the literal Eucharist. To simply call it the blood of Christ is to say no more than a Protestant would say. Many use the word completely figuratively. So what they do is assume transubstantiation and read it into Ignatius' words without even realizing it. Yet, even when we read the whole chapter, we see no signs that Ignatius had a literal Eucharist in mind, or a miraculous yet invisible transformation of a substance changing the feast of bread and wine into a meal of literal human flesh. We don't see this at all. If we're reading chapter 6 through 7, which I mentioned earlier, that says no more than a Protestant would say. Me, when debating Ignatius, I actually agree with him on this topic. A lot of people are surprised, but I actually do. Here's the next important part. People also assume Ignatius must always be speaking literal. We can often see him using metaphors within his letters. For example, in one of his letters, in chapter 4 of the same exact letter, he said, "I am God's wheat, and I am being ground by the teeth of the wild beast, so that I may prove to be pure bread." Obviously, we know that Ignatius is not speaking of a literal grinding of bread, which is himself. So he often uses metaphoric language when speaking of serious topics. I think the problem that most Roman Catholics have, or Eastern Orthodoxy members, is that they assume that whatever Ignatius says must be literal. And if you're going to do that, you must assume this is literal too, which you won't be able to defend. In another letter, he said, "You therefore must arm yourselves with gentleness and regain your strength in faith, which is the flesh of the Lord, and in love, which is the blood of Christ." And this is Ignatius of Antioch, letter to the Trallians. I don't really know how to pronounce it, but it is chapter 8. Here, faith is the flesh of Christ, and his love is his blood. Clearly, it's poetic language, not meant to be read in a literal sense. Now, here's one of the biggest points of this video, is that if we actually analyze Ignatius' letter, he's not even regarding or addressing the metaphysics of the Eucharist, but rather about the docetists and their rejection of Christ's human nature. For example, if we're reading chapter 2 of this letter, he says, "For he suffered all these things for our sakes, in order that we might be saved. And he has truly suffered just as he truly raised himself, not as certain unbelievers say, that he suffered in appearance. Only it is that they who exist in appearance only. Indeed, their fate will be determined by what they think. They will become disembodied and demonic." And this is chapter 2. Let's take a look in chapter 5. Ignatius says this, "Certain people ignorantly deny him, or rather have been denied by him, for they are advocates of death rather than of the truth. Neither the prophecies nor the law of Moses have persuaded them, nor, thus far, the gospel, nor our own individual suffering, for they think the same thing about us. For what good does it do to me if someone praises me but blasphemes my Lord, by not confessing that he was clothed in the flesh? Anyone who does not acknowledge this, thereby denies him completely, and is clothed in a corpse. Given that they are unbelievers, it did not seem worthwhile to me to record their names. Indeed, far be it from me even to remember them, until such a time as they change their minds regarding the passion, which is our resurrection. And this is chapter 5. So, if we're thinking of what is the purpose of this letter, what is he really trying to express? We constantly see, throughout which I just read, him talking about they don't confess that he was clothed in the flesh. They don't acknowledge him. They say he suffered in appearance only. What is all of this saying? Well, like I've said before, he is regarding Christ's actual blood, his literal flesh, not in the sense of the sacrament, but his actual ontology, who Christ actually was. The issue is not what these false teachers believe about the physical nature of the bread and wine during communion. It's what they believe about the nature of Jesus himself and his passion and his resurrection. There is no issue with the symbolism of the Eucharist, but rather other parts of the view. They believe that Christ only seemed to suffer on the cross, as a divine being is incapable of dying in a human form, as they would say. The Eucharist to them was irrelevant, obviously because they believed it had no meaning at all, since Christ's blood was never poured out. It had nothing to do with the symbolism, but rather they had a completely different view of what the Eucharist actually means. Because if we're thinking of the Eucharist, right, what was the purpose of Christ bringing out this ordination? To remember his sacrifice, right? To remember what he's actually done. And so when he symbolically demonstrates that this is his flesh and blood, as we know it's not literal, he's trying to get us to remember, or he's allowing us to remember what he did on the cross. And the thing with the docetists, though, is that the reason they abstain from the Eucharist is not because they don't think it's literal, but because they don't believe his flesh was even poured out for our sake. And so let's take a look at chapter 7. Therefore, those who deny the good gift of God perish in their consciousness. It would be more to their advantage to love, in order that they might also rise up. It is proper, therefore, to avoid such people, and not speak about them either privately or publicly. Do pay attention, however, to the prophets, and especially to the gospel, in which the passion has been made clear to us, and the resurrection has been accomplished. So, you are not to avoid these teachers because they might mislead you on the nature of the Eucharist. You are to avoid them because they deny this, what the scriptures teach about the suffering, death, and the resurrection of Christ, his blood pouring out on the cross. So then, what is Ignatius's point on bringing up communion at all? He is illustrating the falsehood of these heretical beliefs. He points out that they can't even participate in communion because they can't even speak of the bread and cup as the body of blood, since they don't believe that Jesus had the body or blood. And now the one who using Ignatius in order to prove the literal Eucharist might say, well, you Protestants and the Docetists believe in the same thing. But that's not the case at all. Even if one takes the bread and wine to simply symbolize and commemorate the literal blood and body, rather than him physically transforming into the bread, they still cannot agree with us because such a symbol assumes a reality that these false teachers could not affirm. So he's not even addressing our theology. He's not even addressing what Protestants proclaim, because we proclaim that Christ actually suffered and died on the cross with a physical body. If Jesus' appearance on earth itself was only a figure or image of a body and not an actual body, then what could the bread be a symbol of? It couldn't be a symbol of anything. And so these heretics had to reject communion, and that's the entire reason it was brought up in the first place. In conclusion, Ignatius did not teach a literal Eucharist, but rather he was condemning the false teachers who didn't proclaim Christ had a body. And the reason he brought up the Eucharist was to show that they couldn't even partake in this God-given element due to their understanding of his nature and how he actually died. And so, a thing to keep in mind, now knowing this information, when dealing with Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodoxy members who proclaim a literal Eucharist, is that once you show them this evidence and how Ignatius doesn't actually profess what they profess, they will consider you wrong and say you're lying. And then they might even say, well, you're going against our theology, and we have scholars who claim to know what Ignatius says. But then again, that would be another example of the fallacy of tradition or fallacy of proximity, because age doesn't really matter when dealing with truthfulness, like I've already demonstrated. And oftentimes when I have debated over Ignatius, I have had people say, I've debated Protestants and they agreed that Ignatius believed in a literal Eucharist. And my response to that is that any Protestant who has ever actually read Ignatius's letters and actually looked into it would know that this is not the case. I think that if a Protestant were to concede and agree with Rome on this topic, they haven't studied or even read or properly understood what Ignatius actually meant. And so keep in mind when debating, they will most likely not take it very well. They've been, taught a specific topic for a long time. This is one of their biggest offenses, and just to have it come crumbling down is tragic for them. So always do this with gentleness. Always be loving in discourse, because we don't want to be too harsh in this and actually have them flee from Protestantism, even if we make a good point. Because we can make all the good points in the world and have them still flee to something else due to our unkindness. So always do this with gentleness, and always remember that exegesis is important, theology is important, and have a blessed day, guys. The last thing I'd like to add for resources is that this wonderful man named Matt Slick, he owns Christian Apologetic Research Ministry. It is an online research organization that helps defend Christianity, and he actually wrote an article where I got a lot of this information off of, and I'll link it down in the description. He's a very great guy, wonderful, very smart, and a lot of this information I actually did find on his website. And yes, I did do my own studies. I have read Ignatius's letters, and I can agree that a lot of the things that Matt Slick said, I would agree with too, and I hope you would as well. So I'll link him down in the description below. Go check him out. He might have more articles regarding this, and have a blessed day, guys. Take care.